For this last lecture, I'd like to talk about looking towards the future. So we've talked about the credibility revolution and the reforms that it's been pushing for. And there are many different manifestations that this is taking, registered reports, a Psych Science Accelerator, and so on. So one thing I'm curious about is whether these reforms are going to be enough to offset the problems we've identified, where things are going to go in the future. And also, as a teacher, I'm curious about what teaching people about both the problems and the solutions and the reforms does to people's belief and trust in psychology. Luckily, there's actually been a study of exactly this. So Envari and Lockins actually looked at how learning about the replicability crisis affects public trust in psychology using a convenience sample of over 1,000 participants. So in their study, they randomly assigned people to one of 4 conditions. So a control group that didn't learn anything new about psychology, whatever they knew before was all the information they had. The second condition, they learned just about the replication crisis, so the problems of failed replications, false positives. A third group learned about the replication crisis and why those problems are there, p-hacking, etc. So this is still the problems, but it's like a double dose of the problems. We have a problem, and it's because people are doing these questionable things. And then the fourth group learned about the problems, but also the solutions, the reforms. And after participants were exposed to one of these 4 conditions, they were asked about how much they trust past research, how much they trust future research, and what they think about funding for psychology research. So I'm going to show you the results next. And so it's across those 4 different conditions, the participants' ratings of first trust in past research in psychology. So here are the results for the 4 groups. They look quite similar. So on a 1 to 10 scale, people had kind of varying levels of trust in past research in psychology. But actually what this obscures is there was a significant difference, and it was p less than 0.001, I think, or it was a very small p-value. So despite the fact that these 4 groups look quite similar, they actually are quite different. And the control group is higher than the other 3 groups. So people who don't learn about any problems have more trust in past research than people who learn about problems, even if they also learn about the reforms, the purple group. What about trust in future research? So are these groups different? Sure, if you don't learn about the problems, you trust past research more. But if you learn about the problems and solutions, do you trust future research as much as people who never learned about either? Here, actually, what we see is that the reform group, the purple group, is lower than the others. So even though the reform group learned about potential solutions and attempts to fix these problems, they still had a bit less trust in the future of psychology research than the other 3 groups. But actually, the control group was the same as the groups that learned about the problems. So that's kind of interesting. It seems like learning about the reforms might actually make people a little bit less optimistic, maybe because they learned about how challenging it will be to fix this, right? We have to do things like pre-registration and registered reports and be more open and so on, which is probably not going to be easy. So this was interesting. And as somebody who teaches people about both the problems and the solutions, I was curious to see what I was doing to my students in my class. So back at the University of California, Davis, where I used to teach, I would teach a class of 300 undergraduate students about research methods, and I would give a few lectures similar to the ones you just heard from me about the problems and the solutions in psychology. So I decided to run a little replication study, not for real, but just for my own interest, looking at what happens with these 300 students as they learn about the replication crisis and the reform movement. So here, I couldn't randomly assign people to either learn about nothing, the problems, or the problems and the solutions. So I just measured things over time before they learned about either the problems or solutions. So I measured the variables I was interested in, which is how interested are you in getting involved in psychology research? These are about half of the students who take this class are psychology majors. And then how much do you trust past research in psychology and how much do you trust future research in psychology? So these 2 variables were copied from the Envari and Lockins study. So first I measured these things before I told them about any of the problems. Then we did the lecture on the replication crisis and p-hacking and all the problems. Then I measured these variables again. So this is a repeated measures design within subjects. Then I did the lecture on the reforms and the solutions and the credibility revolution, and we measured the variables again. So this is how I measured the variables. So how interested are you in getting involved in psychology research was on a 1 to 5 scale. And their answers they were not anonymous, but they were confidential, and it would be very hard for me to link their answers to their identity. So they might have felt relatively free, to be honest, but that's up for debate. Okay, so before I taught them about either the problems or the solutions, what were their views about how interested they are in getting involved in psychology research? So here we're comparing The blue bars are time 1, so at the beginning, before learning about any of the problems. Some of them were kind of interested in getting involved in psychology research, but the modal answer was 3 on a 5-point scale. And then after learning about the problems and the solutions, the orange bars, about the same. And in fact, when I compare the means of the blue group and the orange group, the same people, but before they knew anything and after they knew everything, no difference. The means are 3.4 in both cases, not a statistically significant difference. I didn't show the middle point, time 2, because it's the same here. So learning about the problems and solutions did not shift their interest in being involved in psychology research. What about the next outcome measure? How much do you trust past research in psychological science? So here, before they learned about anything, their trust wasn't actually all that high. So before learning about the problems or the solutions, a lot of people gave a 3, some more people gave a 4 on a 5-point scale of how much you trust past research. What about after learning about the problems and the solutions? Their trust went down quite a bit. Now, a bunch of people were giving a 2, still a lot of people were still giving a 3, not as many people answering a 4. And this was a relatively large effect, a D of 0.9, so almost a full standard deviation difference downward in their trust in past research. And this was highly statistically significant. What about future research? Okay, so now I'm going to break it up into the 3 groups: before they learned anything, when they just learned about the problems, and then when they learned about the solutions. So before they learned about any of this, their trust in future research was actually quite high, higher than their trust in past research. So the modal answer was a 4 on a 5-point scale. After they learned about the problems, it went down. So now a lot more people gave a 3 on a 5-point scale in terms of their trust in future research after they learned about the problems. And then when they learned about the solutions, it went back up a bit, but not all the way to the levels that it was before. So learning about the solutions restored trust a bit, but not up to the levels of before they knew about the problems. And all 3 of these groups are different from each other, all 3 of the time points. So at time 1, trust in future research, the mean was 3.7, then it went down to 3.2, then it went back up to 3.5. All 3 of those means are different from each other at p less than 0.001, and the effect sizes are moderately large, 0.3 to 0.6. So what does this mean? Well, we can critique the study, and there's a lot to critique here. It was, first of all, not a real study. I was collecting data just to see what happens in the class that I taught. And we could ask whether my manipulations and measures are valid, so critique the construct validity. Well, my measures were pretty ad hoc. I had not validated them, so that's already a red flag. My manipulation was also a bit sloppy. As I taught them about p-hacking and the problems, I probably had other material in there that might have also been included, so I might have taught them about more than just strictly the problems in psychology research. Maybe the day that I gave that lecture, I was more or less enthusiastic than the day that I gave the lecture on solutions and reforms. So it's possible my manipulation was also not that clean, not that valid. Internal validity. If I want to claim that it's my lectures that cause these shifts in the students' trust in past and future research, I'd have to rule out confounds and demand characteristics and so on. Here, I think those are a real threat. So it's possible that students felt like they should say that their trust went down when they learned about their problems and then back up when they learned about the solutions, right? They know what I might expect. So that's a really big problem and threat to internal validity. External validity, would these results generalize? So maybe they're dependent on my way of teaching, and if somebody else had taught these same topics, we would have found different results. Or maybe these results are specific to university students in the US and wouldn't generalize to university students in other areas, or maybe just psychology university students and not other majors. So we have to be really careful here to make claims that generalize beyond just what we studied. What about statistical validity? Well, I had 300 participants, which is pretty large sample size, but it could be bigger. My p-values, when they were significant, were very small. And then I had one that was a non-significant effect. I'd have to go beyond p-values if I wanted to know if that non-significant effect was actually strong evidence for absence of an effect. I can't just rely on the p-values. So I would flag that as a statistical validity issue. But if we can trust these results, which is a big if, I would not trust these results very far. But to the extent that we can corroborate these results in future studies, this would suggest that while teaching people about the problems in psychology is certainly possible to reduce their trust in psychology, teaching them about the solutions might be a good way to restore that trust, and especially if we actually follow through on those proposed reforms and solutions. So with these many movements and activities happening in psychology, I'm hopeful that we will continue to improve and make progress and give people many good reasons to trust psychology research.